Hello everyone, my name is Shelby Moore, and this is going to be the first video covering Chapter 2 in Macro and Microeconomics. In this video, we'll take a look at model building, trade gains, and the scientific method in economics. Some big questions that I want you to consider while we're watching these lecture videos and thinking about Chapter 2 are: how do economists study the economy? What is a production possibilities frontier? What are the benefits of specialization in trade? And what is the trade-off between having more now and having more later? Keeping these questions in mind will help you structure your notes and your study time as you work through Chapter 2. First up, we want to talk about model building and gains from trade. In economics, it's not always going to be easy to study a huge group of people or a country or even the world, and that's why we use model building. In economics, we use the scientific method, much like you did in all of your science classes. We'll use positive and normative analysis and overall build economic models. Another thing that we're going to take a look at is how we can develop gains from trade. This will be our production possibilities frontier covered later in the chapter, talking about economic growth because of that trade, and then specialization in trade itself. We're going to first look at how economists build models, and once we learn about that process, we'll take a look at the production possibilities frontier model to learn about things like advantages of specialization, trade, and investment. Something for you to think about: what are some benefits and costs of being here in college? In Chapter 1, we discussed the cost of college, but in this chapter, we're going to focus on the trade-off of going to college versus not going. The biggest cost of college is the foregone income while you're in school. Lower income means that as a student, you can't really buy as much, and you also have to postpone things like getting a house, a new car, taking vacations, and so on. Some benefits of going to college are that you can make a higher income in the future. You can end up with a better job in the future that's maybe less physical or in a cleaner environment. And the point here that I'm getting at is that you want to realize that you're giving up consumption today for more or better consumption tomorrow. And that's the whole idea with these economic models and trades. Economics is just like all other sciences in the approach it takes to answer questions. We have the scientific method where we observe a phenomenon, we develop a hypothesis, we then construct a model to test that hypothesis. We look for opportunities to test how well our model works, and then we revise or refute the theory based on evidence. So when you say phenomenon, in this case, let's say people are buying more hybrid automobiles. That's the phenomenon that we're observing. The hypothesis that we can make is the price of hybrids has fallen and that the price of gasoline is going up. The model that we might build to test the theory is a supply and demand analysis. So we'll get to that model in the next chapter, but just keep in mind that's an example of a model. And then we would experiment. We'd gather data on car prices, gasoline prices, hybrid cells, and other variables that are important to us. After that, we'll run appropriate statistical tests and draw conclusions. Now, economics does differ from other sciences in important ways. One thing, economists don't use a controlled lab. Economic behavior takes place in the world around us, and economists cannot always run controlled experiments and may sometimes have to rely on historical data. The next thing I want to look at is positive and normative analysis. Keep in mind that as an economist, you want to do your best to remain objective. When we're looking at something like a rise in the unemployment rate, as an economist, we want to understand why it occurred, and we don't want to determine who should receive unemployment benefits or other government assistance. We're just looking at the why. As an economist, we're going to focus on positive statements. So these are things that can be tested and validated, and they describe what is. So an example of that is income in the United States has been increasing. It's just a what is statement. Normative things are what we want to stay away from as economists. These are opinions that we can't test or validate. And these are kind of those what ought to be scenarios that we come up with in our head. An example they provide in your book is that the United States should send foreign aid to other countries. This isn't a positive statement because it's not something that can be tested. It's not something that can be validated. It's more of an opinion than an actual legitimate positive statement. To provide you with a little bit of practice, we're going to take a look at a couple of statements and determine if they're positive or normative. So the first statement is rich people should be taxed more. In this case, this is a normative statement because should is not objective. Number 2 says more taxes on the rich will increase tax revenues. This is a positive statement because we can test that. Statement 3 says everyone should donate to charity. Again, this contains the word should. It's not objective, and it's a normative statement. So bad is kind of a broad or poorly defined term. Whenever we're looking at number 4, it says government intervention in markets is bad. And because of this, it is a normative statement. But we could potentially turn this into a positive statement if we listed more specific markets, government interventions, and the change in other variables like prices, quantities, or consumer surplus. Now, statement 5 says that economics majors earn more on average than sociology majors do. In this case, this is a positive statement because we can look at the salaries of graduates to figure out if this is true or false. And in this case, it is true. As you move forward in this chapter, make sure that you understand the difference in positive and normative statements because it is something that will come up a little bit later on in this chapter and in your economics classes as a whole. So next up, we want to talk about economic models. Models are just simplified versions of reality that we use to understand complex real-world economy. Models are going to simplify reality by making assumption, and in order to be a good model, it needs to be simple, flexible, and accurate in making predictions. A map is a good example of a model. It's not completely realistic. Obviously, a map of the United States is not the actual size of the United States. It doesn't have all the stop signs, traffic lights, speed limits, and points of interest, but it can get you from point A to point B. It does serve its purpose. In economics, our goal is to come up with good economic models that are simplified versions of reality that are flexible and accurate in making these predictions. Another important concept in economics is ceteris paribus, and this just means other things being equal in Latin. This is a central assumption in model building, and it allows us to study the effect of one variable by holding everything else constant. So the goal in any of these scientific methods with economics is to isolate the effect of a change in one particular variable. If you were suppose that you were having stomach issues or stomach difficulties, if you went ahead and just changed your entire diet pretty drastically, like eliminating gluten, dairy, processed foods, all of that, you wouldn't actually know what was causing the problem if you were to get better. So what you would want to do is you would want to use ceteris paribus, meaning you would hold all other things equal and remove one food group at a time. Then if you were to improve, you would know specifically what caused that improvement. Now, when we're looking at some types of factors as a researcher, we're not able to control everything in a model. This is why we have to break things down into endogenous and exogenous factors. Endogenous factors are going to be variables that we can control inside of our model, and exogenous factors are variables that we cannot account for in a model. As more and more exogenous variables are added into the model, which can make them endogenous, the more realistic the model becomes. Now, suppose that we're interested in how a person chooses how many hours to work. Some endogenous factors would be how much he or she is paid, and some exogenous factors would be that particular individual's work ethic. So keep that in mind. Endogenous we can control. Exogenous are things that cannot be controlled or accounted for in a model. As we work on building these economic models and testing them using scientific method, we have to be aware of the danger of faulty assumptions. It's often pretty necessary to examine and reevaluate our assumptions and models. So what variables should we include? What variables should we exclude? And we don't want to leave out any important assumptions from our model, but we also don't want to include any faulty ones. A good example of this is that prior to 2006, bank models assumed that real estate prices would always continually rise. They had risen for many years in the past, and we had no reason to think that's not what would continue to happen. But we found out this was a faulty assumption, and it cost banks and other financial organizations a great deal of money during the financial crisis. Now, when we move on to constructing a model, a good example here is we can look at the question, who should get paid more? We have a few areas of interest that we've listed. So we have educated versus uneducated individuals, skilled or unskilled laborers, workers that have just finished college or workers that are older, new employees versus veterans, or safe and dangerous jobs. All of these things are interesting to consider. But on the last question, let's kind of focus on that a little bit more. A good example of this is the show The Deadliest Catch. So on this show, they go out on a boat, they are catching various sea life for consumption, things like that, but it is a pretty dangerous job. So even though some of the people on the show are pretty young, they're relatively unskilled, and they don't really have that college degree, these Alaskan crab fishermen get paid a lot of money because that particular job is very dangerous. Now, just because this one instance results in people getting paid more for doing a dangerous job, you might want to also keep in mind there are a lot of dangerous jobs that pay very little. And that's because we're not able to control other variables like education and skill. Some things that you want to take into account whenever we're looking at a model to predict the wage of a person are things like their level of education, their age, their experience, their skills, the working conditions, and their gender. The goal is to determine the effect of each variable separately, and we have to use that ceteris paribus assumption. We want to know what happens if we change just one of the variables and hold the rest constant. How will that overall wage be affected? And in this case, these are endogenous variables. So in this case, I also want you to try to think about if you can come up with any exogenous variables. To get you started, some good examples would be things like the labor market conditions and the state of the economy, whether we're in a boom or a bust. To wrap up this video, I want to provide you with another practice what you know question. The question here says, what is a possible problem with using faulty assumptions when building an economic model? And the answer choices are that the model could become too popular, it could lead to poor economic decisions, it means we never have to rebuild the model, or it could cause too much wealth. And in this case, the correct answer is choice B. It could lead to poor economic decisions. If your model is based on bad assumptions, the results that are given may not have the desired real-world results that you'd hoped for. Something you can think about, the financial crisis that we talked about a few slides ago, the models did not include a variable for falling home prices because we always assumed that home prices would never fall. And because of this faulty assumption, it led to poor economic decisions that ultimately resulted in the housing crisis. That's going to wrap up this first video for chapter 2. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, you can head over to Blackboard and watch the next one. Thank you.